and welcome to my channel. My name is Karina and I like to create things. So normally on this channel I talk about creating stories, and I'm actually going to be self-publishing my first novel in a few weeks, and I need to be making a costume piece for me to wear for the book trailer. So my novel is a Christian historical fiction novel set in the 17th century, and I already have most of the costume pieces to match the book cover. The only thing that I have not yet made are the stays, or the corset, to match what Ruth, my main character, is wearing on the front cover. So this is going to be a two-part video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how I made the mock-up, and in the next video, which will be coming out in a week or two, I will be showing you how I made the finished piece in yellow. So the first thing that I did was I located what pattern I wanted to use. Unfortunately, the 17th century, when my novel takes place, falls right in between the more well-known Tudor/Elizabethan fashions and the fashions of the 18th century, the 1700s. The 17th century is kind of a much lesser known, much less popular, much harder to find information on period as far as fashion history, and also, unfortunately, the Tudor and the 18th century both have pretty recognizable fashion silhouettes and design elements that even the most relaxed of observer, I think, would be able to notice the differences of. But the 17th century, at least in my opinion, when I view it, feels like a very transitional period. There were changes in the fashion throughout the century, obviously, as there are, in my observation, always are in fashion throughout a century. But finding out the different changes to the silhouette throughout the different decades was pretty difficult, and honestly I feel like the decades of fashion are pretty confusing and complicated for me, even in the more well-known periods and centuries. So at the end of my research, though, I did make the general observation that it seemed to me kind of like the 17th century was a sort of cross between the Tudor period and the 18th century period. Now, I know that that might be totally incorrect, but at least in my mind it stood to reason that from the patterns that I was able to find, I should just pick one from either the next century or the last century, since I totally do not have enough pattern drafting experience to actually come up with my own pattern for this. And something like a pattern that I would purchase from a store online or whatever, that I would have to grade up or whatever from a PDF. I know you can find patterns that would be closer to this time period, or at least I would totally imagine that from some of the historical corset pattern places you could find that. I would not be comfortable with that kind of pattern drafting yet at my level of skill, expertise, or whatever. So I knew I wanted to try and stick with a simplicity pattern because I've worked with simplicity patterns before, and as the name would imply, they would theoretically be a lot simpler than if I tried to find a pattern elsewhere. So simplicity has made patterns for both a Tudor pair of stays and an 18th century pair of stays. Now, I ended up deciding to go with the Tudor pair of stays. It just seemed like it worked better for my purposes. There wasn't any particular reasoning. It does lace in the back, which is technically more historically accurate for the time period that I'm looking at, but on the front book cover, Ruth is wearing stays that lace up the front because that existed too in this time period, so it really just came down to whichever one I wanted to use for my personal preference. Now, unfortunately, the simplicity pattern for Tudor stays is out of print at this time. You cannot find it, in print. You can only find it, at a second-hand kind of a place or a site or whatever. I was able to find one that was reasonably priced on Etsy, and fortunately was actually, able to receive it for a gift for my birthday, so I was very grateful for that. But this was not something that I wanted to be cutting out and using for my purposes, so I ended up using a tracing kind of system that I'll tell you about in a minute. And an additional reason for me to be not cutting this up, because, these out-of-print patterns do often sell for a very pretty penny, I knew that I was going to be having to make some very large and substantial adjustments to the pattern size, because as you may well know, simplicity patterns come in two size like levels. There's the smaller sizes that come in one level, and then there's the larger sizes that come in another level. The pattern pack that I have is the larger sizes level, and my personal size, or at least the closest size to my personal measurements, is in the lower level. And even if I had gotten the size level that would have my measurements, I still would have had to adjust it because I don't know who they're making these patterns for, but I'm a slender person and my waist is not nearly as skinny as they said it should be for the rest of my body measurements. So I knew that I was going to have to make size adjustments regardless, and you know, even if my pattern had been the right size, I would have had to anyway. So this tracing method that I ended up using worked pretty good for getting the pattern onto a different piece of paper or whatever, so I could make size adjustments without tampering with the original in any way, because that thing is valuable. It's worth mentioning that not only will this be my first time ever size patterning, adjusting, like I just mentioned, but this will also be my first time creating a structured garment like this before. I have not made structured garments to this level at all in the past. I did make a corset belt, or a few different versions of a corset belt before, but that wasn't really, you know, like a true corset. And then I also at one point tried to make like a Renaissance inspired vest for my brother, and I did not use a pattern. I tried to go purely off of body measurements, and I did not yet know about where to put ease and where to leave room for the shoulders and stuff like that. It was a disaster. So I learned my lesson then, you know, to use patterns whenever you're doing a fitted structured garment like this, but this will be my first time doing that, and also grading pattern sizes up and down. So yeah, creating this mock-up, it was an adventure. So the first thing that I did was I transferred the pattern and the markings onto wax paper from the smallest size available that I had to work with on the original pattern. And then, because I knew I wanted to make size adjustments and I didn't want to have to break out the original pattern every time I needed a new pattern piece, I traced the wax paper patterns onto wrapping paper. And that way I was able to make size adjustments from there. You can see that I folded in a certain amount, and I'll explain that in just a second. So I knew that I needed to take it in 6 inches at the bust, 3 inches at the waist. And as I sat down to make this video, I actually realized that I did some of my calculations a little bit wrong, and some of them were a little bit off. So that does explain a little bit of why I had to do so much adjusting, as you will see later in this video. But my original thinking was that at every joint on the top part, at this top part, I would take in 1/2 inch on each side of the pattern to make an inch total, and if there had been 6 seams all the way around, that would have amounted to 6 inches. Trouble is, I went and actually checked my stays mock-up that is now finished, and I realized that in fact there are only 4 connecting seams. So instead of taking in 6 inches, I only took in 4, and at the bottom where I took in a 1/4 of an inch on each side to amount to 1/2 inch all around, which would have amounted to 1/2 times 6 seams is 3, which is how much I need to take in at the waist according to my calculations. Instead of having taken in, you know, 3 inches or whatever, I'd only taken in like, you know, 1.5 inches or something like that. So that does explain why I had a little bit of discrepancy later, although I probably still would have had to tweak it anyway because, you know, that's important, and sometimes the pattern doesn't fit like we expect it to, so we have to do tweaking anyway. But yeah, that was my thinking, and you can actually see here on this pattern where I literally took a ruler and I marked like 1/2 inch at the top, 1/4 of an inch at the bottom, connected them, folded it, and then that was my adjusted size. So that worked pretty well, but I counted my seams wrong, and you know, it was definitely a good place to start. The other thing was that at this point I was just guessing whenever I took in the same amount at each seam connection all the way around. I didn't know how these are supposed to fit. I didn't know where the fullness of everything, for the lack of a better word, was supposed to sit. So I knew it was entirely possible that like I needed to take more in at the back than I did at the front. But this was a good starting place, and for the first steps, what I did worked pretty good. And it was definitely a strategy that I might try using again in the future. I just need to make sure that I actually count my seams correctly.
So after going through my fabric stashes, I decided to use a black cotton fabric I had quite a bit of for the main fabric of the stays, and then I decided to use a gray, also cotton fabric for the lining.
Here is a very... Oh! I do not know why this is in my fabric stash. When I was organizing my fabric, I saw this folded up and I thought it was fabric. Oh, this goes in my costumes. That is too funny. This is the first version of a cotton shift that I made that I did not do some things right when I was drafting the pattern for myself, and it doesn't fit correctly. So I need to put this with my kind of costume slash historical outfit stuff, even though I can't wear it. If I'm ever going to do custom work with somebody else, or let's say I'm ever putting on a play or a short film like I do dream of doing someday, and I need a slightly smaller shift, that'll work. So that goes put away somewhere. Behold me very glamorously trying on this piece of black fabric to make sure I'd still have enough for a French hood after using part of it for one of the pieces, because I got the fabric iron and I went to test the grain again, and I think the grain does not work the same as I thought it did on a couple of the pieces. So I think I'm gonna need this for one of the back pieces with the shoulder strap. But I have decided to not worry about cutting the strap in one piece for the mock-up. I'm gonna attach it because finding a piece long enough to have that tiny little strap with the grain going the right way is like, forget it. So I'm going to cut the back piece and then the shoulder strap separately so I can do it with the fabric I have. So then it was cutting time. One piece down, a bunch to go. Ugh. I just realized that I did not need to include seam allowance on the top and bottom of my pattern pieces because there's no seam going in there because I'm not finishing the edges. So now I gotta go back and chop that off of my pattern pieces that I spent so much time deliberately making sure it was perfect. I hope those of you who have like a bunch of experience sewing are not like laughing at me hysterically in the background, because I know this has to be absolutely silly.
Next, you will see me trying to figure out the best way to transfer the boning channel markings from the pattern onto my piece of kind of imitation lining fabric. I'm just cutting a big enough piece of quote-unquote lining fabric to put the channels in. I'm not lining the whole thing because it saves fabric and I only need it there just for a place for the bones to go in. So next I attached the lining pieces by sewing in the boning channels and then added the shoulder strap too. I then repeated the process of tracing out the lining, cutting it out, and marking the boning channels for the remainder of the pieces. So here are the pieces. These, I just realized I needed a piece of boning in the edge to help with when I lace it up with supporting that edge so that it doesn't, like, you know, wrinkle up whenever I've laced it shut. But I realized I probably should have just gone ahead and lined this whole part because the other ones had so much boning I just lined the whole thing. Oh well. So after I do this, then I just have to put them all together. Now it was time for the fun of trying on and readjusting. Oh boy. Okay, so the lighting right now is horrible, so I apologize. I always tend to work on these projects in like the late day, so it always makes for horrible film lighting. So it is like no good indication right now because it is not bone, but I am already in love with the silhouette this is going to give me. It's going to be like so quintessentially Renaissance, but I have a problem. I haven't boned this yet, but I decided to go ahead and try it on just to make sure everything was right, and I'm glad I did because there is supposed to be room in the back for me to lace, and I don't know if you can see, but this overlaps by a good few inches. I think my mom said about 3 inches when she was looking at it for me, and that doesn't even take into account leaving a gap to lace it with. So on the back of the pattern here, or on the cover of the pattern, you can see that the model is wearing it with a very, very small gap there. Now, I probably need to give myself
a little bit of extra room because I am a fairly slender person, and I don't know how that translates into pattern making, but I sized this down in my measurements according to, you know, what the pattern said it was sized for, and I still did not get a gap in the back to lace with, even though I directly sized down to my body measurements based on what measurements it said that the size I used was for. So I don't know if it's the way I'm built, if it's the way I sized the pattern, or what. As far as the fit, I'm not gonna know until I take in some extra and bone it. But the only thing at the moment that I think for sure I'm gonna wanna adjust is this front panel here. You're probably not gonna be able to tell because it's black, but it is slightly doing this, like splaying out like an A. And I think it would be more flattering if it was just straight up and down. And the original pattern, it's straight up and down, but because I took in more of the bust than I did at the waist, it is naturally making an A shape. And so what I'll probably do is in the final version of this, I will adjust that space and I move that space to one of the other pieces so that I can get a straight line up and down here. But yeah, I mean, just looking at myself in the camera, I'm getting totally like Tudor Renaissance vibes, and I'm not even actually laced into this thing, so this is gonna be fun. And there's absolutely no structure to it right now because I did not bone it, which now I'm glad because I think I need to be making dinner now. But whenever I have a chance, not sure when that will be, I need to take this in by about 3 inches all around. So what I'll probably do is take it in. I don't want to mess too much with the boning channels because if I take it in around the boning channels, I will not leave as much room for them, and I don't want to mess with that. So what I'll probably do is take it in mostly at the back, because I think whenever I put this on, it's hitting me in the front, the seams, according to what the front says and according to pictures of similar garments that I have seen on Pinterest and things like that. I think it's hitting me in the right spots in the front, and it's hitting me where I think I would like for it to hit in the front. The true test will be once I get it boned. So I think I'm going to take it in at the side panel and at the back. In fact, if anything, this top piece, like I said, needs to go out a little bit more. So I'm definitely going to take it in at the back side and back. I can't take it in right here, I don't think, because I won't leave any room for the lacing holes. I haven't completely decided how I'm going to go about lacing this yet. I am going to put a piece of boning. Yes, this is a hideous lining job. I should have just done it like I did this part, but I am not planning on ever finishing this mock-up. That's what a mock-up is for. So I'm going to put a piece of boning right there. Obviously, I'm pretty sure the pattern even called for that, to reinforce, because otherwise this will bend and pucker up when you go to lace it. But I don't want to take the time to do eyelets, and I do not want to take the time to do grommets. So I'm not sure if it will work to just cut holes and lace. Why do I hear laughing in the back of my head? Just like, that's probably not a good idea. But I might try it anyway, and if it doesn't work, I'll just have to get some little bitty grommets or throw in some machine stitching around there. But yeah, I think this is going to work really good. Okay, so ignore the fact that the straps are too short. I think that I'm going to be attaching them like with ribbons to close a different distance so it's more adjustable. But I ended up taking 3 inches total in, and I did not take any in the front panel. And I'll show you in a minute exactly where I took it in, but you can see that when I cinch this, they just barely meet, which honestly it might still be just a hair too big right here in the back. Sorry if my sweatshirt's getting in the way. And I don't know if I can really maneuver to show you since it doesn't actually lace up yet. But up here at the top, it still just wants to overlap just a wee little bit. So yes, I pinned this to my sweater here in the front to keep it from moving around. So where I took it in at is at the back. And you can see that now the curve is not quite right there. Like, it just curves and then it goes straight up. So whenever I adjust my pattern, I will have to tweak that. So I ended up taking it in, I believe it was 1 inch on this panel at this seam and 1/2 inch on this panel at the seam. And of course I remembered seam allowances this time. But, and I had to move the boning channel over because right where the seam needed to go on this side panel was where the boning channel was. So where you see the inner line of that boning channel, I think I forgot to do it on that side. I sure did. I haven't added the new boning channel on that side. This side I did. So what I did was this seam right here, where this seam is that attaches the two panels, this was originally the boning channel. I moved the boning channel over. And I realized that something I'd forgotten to take into account is that on a wider person, the boning channels are going to be farther apart than they are on a person with the smaller circumference. That also made me realize that quite possibly, because this side panel is going to, relatively speaking, stretch over a wider area of my body than maybe normally would. I don't know if that makes any sense. This side panel was originally a lot bigger, but it still has the same amount of boning. So the boning is going to go farther back because the panel was originally bigger than it probably should if I had sized everything down. So what I'm considering doing is not boning this last maybe 1 or 2 channels and just boning this part so that way the boning doesn't go too far back, because I want this thing to hit right. And so what I'll also do is I'll tweak the pattern pieces to where I get a nicer curve right there. And then I had, of course, a boning channel right here on the edge to keep the grommets from messing up and, you know, ripping. And I really don't want to undo that just for like 1 inch or 1/2 inch of room. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do. I could just fold it over and sew it down and put the holes in between that bone and the next bone and that little gray space right there. That would be an option, but I'm concerned that would be a little too much room. But then again, I want to make sure I give myself plenty of room to lace, because otherwise I might put it on and I'm like, yeah, I want this just a little bit tighter. I want it a little more supportive. I personally don't expect this thing to lace like super duper tight. I don't want to tight lace, but I want it to be snug. I want it to feel like it's doing its job. So I want to make sure I can lace it and adjust it as need be. And that way too, like in case my weight fluctuates or if I need to let someone borrow it and they're maybe a little bit smaller, I don't know. I just like the idea of having a little bit more flexibility, which is also why whoever came up with the idea of using ribbons to attach the shoulder strap to the bodice that's such a great idea, because then whether you have a short person or a tall person, it doesn't really make a difference. You can just adjust the length of the ribbons or get new ribbons. Because, you know, historical fashion was a lot more economically aware than our fashion today in some ways. They didn't just throw things out like we do. You know, they adjusted sizes and tweaked things and stuff like that. And that's part of what I love so much about, like, fashion history, is looking at things that they did that I think are really good ideas that maybe we should take into account today. So, anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And now I'll go add that boning channel. And I think I will just fold this over, tack it down, and call that good. I also am not completely sure what I'm going to be doing with this busk pocket area, because I know that I do not want to do a busk. Because in what I know, I don't feel like a busk is historically accurate for even the Tudor period. I feel like more of what I have heard of people using busks came from later periods, like a lot later.
And this is where iMovie decided to corrupt the rest of the footage that I had.
So, long story short, I added the tabs, boned the stays, ran out of boning, had to order more boning, finished the boning, and then tried them on. And of course, I will go ahead and try them on again for you, just so that you can see the finished product, even though my original footage of me trying them on boned did get corrupted. So I know that I totally screwed up the spiral lacing in the back, but I'm still learning how to lace these. I also know that the boning is sticking out of the top of some of the boning channels. I didn't bother to run a seam across the top of the stays because I know I'm just going to be pulling out the boning and putting it in the other stays, but I did cut the boning a little bit too long, and so I'm going to basically like put boning that I have in like the slightly longer channels so that it'll be shorter proportionally. But overall, I'm very happy with how this mock-up turned out. I ended up deciding to leave this front like busk pocket thing unboned. I decided not to hassle with making it lace up, and I also just decided to not bother with the bust. I decided to just leave it as it is. They're plenty supportive how they are right now. The only thing is that they are just a hair too big, so I'm not completely sure how fixing that will look like. And you also might have noticed, if you're observant, that I have not bothered to put the straps up. That I'm sure will help kind of just a little bit with making sure that they don't slip around as I wear them. They'll pull up on this part, which will help keep it from sliding down throughout the day, because for some reason I feel like that could be a thing, that these might try to slide down as I wear them. They do, like I said, have too much room. I am able to slip my whole hand in here, which I want these to be comfortable. I don't want to lace these so much that they are uncomfortable, but at the moment I have laced them as tight as my hands will allow me to lace them. Lacing up the back, spiral lacing on yourself is really a pain. I actually turned them around and laced them up right here and then turned them around on the back and then tightened them. But yeah, I think they fit really good. Like I said, they are just a hair too big, but we can make adjustments, and I'm happy with the result. The other thing that I should mention is I did decide to not bother with grommets, and I just poked holes in the back where the lacing goes according to the lacing marking, and with the boning there, it's worked fine. It hasn't ripped or anything like that. And another adjustment that I'm going to make is I'm going to try to make the back come down a little bit. As you can see, it's just sticking out and not doing anything, which makes sense because I am a shorter person, so since I hadn't adjusted the height of these much at all, it makes sense I would need to be bringing that down. You can see I have used pins to take this in more, in addition to what I did throughout the other parts of this video, along the sides in 4 places where I had some extra. In the back, I did it in between some boning channels, and on the side, I did it where I had extra along here. Now, I ended up using the mock-up for reference whenever I drafted a new pattern so that I could cut out the fabric for the finished stays, and you guys will see that process in the next part to this video, which will be coming out in a week or two, Lord willing. That pattern drafting process helped to preserve what I did with the pins in making it tighter, even though it technically still needs to come in a little bit more. We'll see how that final fitting process goes in the next video. But yeah, they give me a very charming Renaissance shape. So overall, I feel like my stays mock-up was successful. I will be obviously adjusting some things in the final, as you can already tell, I'm sure. And be sure to stay tuned because I will be uploading that video in the next couple of weeks or so, and you will get to see the final version. And of course, sometime around then, probably a little bit later, I will also be uploading my book trailer so you can see the costume in a very nice filmed, actual sort of, I guess, production, if you want to call it that. I don't know if it's fancy enough for it to be called production. But anyway, I'll be wearing them for my book trailer, so if you want to see more pictures of them, you can check it out then. If you enjoyed this video, please do let me know. I know I normally don't do sewing type videos, but this is related to my book, and I also kind of have hoped at some point to show a little bit more of my costuming journey, because for me, I'm interested not just in storytelling with written word, but also with visual arts such as filmmaking. And even though I personally don't have the resources to be filmmaking right now, I feel like costuming can be an interesting way to explore that aspect of telling a story through filmmaking or through plays or whatever, even though I can't do the whole thing right now. Plus, if I ever find a place or an event to go cosplay at as a historical character or as one of my original characters, historical or otherwise, that would be so much fun, and I would absolutely love that. And then I would have the costumes to do it. So please make sure that you like this video if you haven't already, and hit subscribe to join the Karina's Adventures community, where we enjoy talking about all things storytelling and making the world a better place for the Lord with our stories, or perhaps in this case with our storytelling through costumes. I will see you guys next time in the next video. Thank you for sticking until the end. If you are all the way to the end of this video, you are amazing. I know it was longer, and I will see you in the next video, and also in the next video where I am talking about my stays and I do the finished version. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.